So welcome. I'm Paul Pangaro. I'm the current president of the American Society for Cybernetics. We welcome you all here, those faces that are familiar and those that we hope to know better. This is the speaker series, excuse me, which I'll turn over to Pille in a moment, but I wanted to let you know that the American Society for Cybernetics in June of 2024 will be celebrating our 60th anniversary. And it's a storied past. A checkered one might say. The society has had some interesting ups and downs, but we feel that we're going from strength to strength, and we invite you all to look at our website, which we'll put in the chat in a moment, and perhaps consider joining. There's a vibrant discussion list, as well as events like this that we would let you know regularly. So we hope that you'll consider that, and hopefully you'll become part of our community. There are many ways of doing that, of which membership is one. With that, I think I'll hand it over to Pille, who is hosting today. Thank you very much.
And you might have also mentioned, since this is our anniversary year, we are going to be having a conference in Washington, D.C. come next summer. And maybe we can see some of you in person then. So for the moment, welcome indeed to the speaker series, which I had something to do in the beginning of, but right now I am in a more of a backseat role with other people like Mateus taking much more of a innovative approach. I had intended to bring this to you actually as a panel discussion, but unfortunately, two of the people have not been well, and so the third person, Alexander Kravchenko, is going to be now the sole presenter, which is also a very good choice actually, because his work is fundamental to what some of the other researchers were going to be talking about. In other words, talking about language and how our particular understandings of language, the particular way we create words and make distinctions, alters the possible paths we may go. I ran into Alexander actually through constructivist foundations, through editorial work, and discovered a kindred soul, and have had several exchanges with him since then. I think I've been inspired by him in my own direction. Alexander teaches English to people who don't speak English. He's at the university, and has discovered through the process of teaching that we have a misconception of what language is. And I think from there, I should turn it over to you, Alexander. And thank you for staying up so late, too. This is 11 o'clock at night, just before midnight for him, given the time zone differences. And thank you for being here with us. Please.
Sorry. Yeah, it's my pleasure. And can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And it's not very often that I have an opportunity now to meet with colleagues from academic circles. And if necessary, I could stay up all night long because I really enjoy meeting people, sharing views, exchanging ideas. And what I'm going to talk about today is, oops, I'm sorry, wrong button. Wrong button.
Chattanooga choo-choo.
Just a second. So this is the topic of my talk. And I just want to begin with an opening thought, so to speak. Yeah. And with a few aphorisms from some great thinkers, which kind of help me organize the whole talk, the entire talk. And the first is from Montaigne. Nothing is so firmly believed as that which is least known. Another one is from Blaise Pascal. Habit is a second nature that destroys the first. And Friedrich Nietzsche told us that cognition comes through comparison. And there's, of course, Martin Heidegger, who told us that language is the house of being, and in its home human beings dwell. So, what we firmly believe we know about ourselves. Just to sum up the established view, we belong to the species Homo sapiens, thanks to Carl Linnaeus, who chose this name for our species. And we are used to thinking that sapiens is the distinctive feature of humans, which is highly questionable. And I will talk about that. Now, there is a generally shared belief that we are so smart because our brains are bigger and better if we compare them with the brains of other animals, especially higher animals. The ratio of brain mass to body mass, you know. Of course, we have minds, that is the faculty of consciousness and thought, which other animals arguably don't have. And because we are so smart, we invented language as packaging for our thoughts. This is what I especially like, you know, that we invented language as packaging for our thoughts. And of course, it's common belief that we use language to exchange thought, or mental content, or mental representations, or information, or what have you, in the process of communication. But are our beliefs substantiated? Interestingly enough, sapiens is not an observable differential feature of human animals. Neither is it genetically predetermined. And we are not born sapient. We inherit only a predisposition to sapience. And if we look at some of the cases, well-known and described cases of so-called feral children, one of them being the famous genie, we will see that deprivation in the formative years, linguistic deprivation, I mean, results in the inability later on for the deprived person to intellectually develop to what is taken and believed to be the normal level of intelligence that allows to fit in the society. Now, why our brains are bigger and better is not really clear and remains a mystery. And there are a lot of hypotheses, you know, people trying to explain why we are so clever, why we are so smart, but they're all just hypotheses and cannot be taken to be empirically or experimentally grounded. Now, the origin of mind, consciousness, and thought remain unexplained. We don't know what these are. When I say we, I mean, of course, the humankind in general. As for the exchange of thoughts, that presupposes, the idea itself presupposes what Roy Harris used to call telementation. However, we know very well that thoughts don't travel. Now, what about the habit that we have of speaking about language? What is habit? This is a dictionary definition, you know. Now, due to formal education, you know, we developed the habit of viewing language as a culturally just a second. As a culturally acquired skill to use a system of signs for encoding and exchanging thoughts. That is, as a communication tool. What are the implications from such a view? One, language is an artifact. This makes the concept of natural language void. Two, language is an object external to the sapient human being and ontologically different from mind. And unavoidably, a question pops up, which I mark as question 3. What is the relationship between language and mind? Now, 3, words and meanings exist out there as autonomous entities. Language is reified, and Chris Sinha and Jordan Zlatev, you know, use very good terms to refer to reification semantics, using the notions of the semantic or reificatory dogmas of reificatory semantics, the dogma of autonomy and the dogma of compositionality. But I'm not going to dwell into that. Another implication is that meanings are contained in words, hence they contain a metaphor. We think thoughts, we put them in the words as containers and send them as if we were using some kind of postal service. And the receiver unpacks the package and has the thought that we sent the receiver in his brain or mind or whatever it is. And of course, as with any tool, we are free to modify and use language as we see fit. I call this the Humpty Dumpty philosophy of language. When different researchers discussing the same problem, coin or invent new terms or use old terms, in new meanings, arguing that they have a right to do that. And I had a bout with one of my commentators a couple of years ago on that. But again, this is not currently the topic of today's talk. Now, when we say that we use language, so what is the meaning of use? Yeah. Here is again a dictionary definition. So we use something to achieve something, So language is a means of achieving something. And hence the question, what does the use of language help us to achieve? And this is where I come to the concept of the epistemological trap of language. Now, according to Heidegger, we dwell in language as the house of being. But, interestingly enough, this is the house that we cannot leave, even if we wanted to. And what do we call a house that we cannot leave? And because we cannot leave this house, we cannot look at it from some vantage point and compare it to something else. Remember, Nietzsche says everything is learned, or cognition comes through comparison. Language is interpretatively terminal. We need language to describe and analyze language. And we are trapped epistemologically in language. Language constrains our cognition. We see the world through the prism of language, and if we remember what Heinz von Förster used to say, language comes first and the world is a consequence of it. But what do we see when we look out of the house in which we dwell? We see the world which is in great ecological havoc brought about by our species, Homo sapiens. Are we really wise, as the name implies? And why do we not live up to our name, wise man? And of course, that's the ultimate question. How can the ecological balance on our planet be restored? I believe that most of the problems that the humankind is facing today are rooted in our misunderstanding and misconceptions about language, the very language we speak. Because, as I said, a certain set of views, that constitute the general picture of what language is instilled on us during our education, formal education in school and in college. And we live, thinking of language the way we've developed a habit to think about it. And this is because we cannot see the big picture. And to see the big picture, we need a systems approach to language. And this is what Umberto Maturana, in my opinion, tried to do, and he did it pretty well. Now, what is this systems approach? Well, I want to first specify what the point of departure is. We should not forget and always remember that everything is connected to everything else. All right? And to escape the epistemological trap, we must learn to speak differently about languages embodied and enacted in the dynamics of human organism environment systems. And this is not the kind of talk about language that we find in educational settings, Children at school and then later on students in colleges are taught that language is a tool, a means of communication. Communication is exchange of information and so on and so forth. And this is really something very, very far off, the mark, and doesn't help in understanding ourselves. If you remember what Socrates used to say, know thyself, and humankind has been trying to know what we actually are as a human species, but so far we cannot boast of having achieved much in this venue. And I believe that a new eco-linguistic or biocognitive paradigm is needed in the study of language if you want to change the situation and if you want to use a systems approach. Now, what is this, what I call biologic of an eco-linguistic approach to language? First, we must understand that language is a unique species-specific feature of humans. No other animals have language, no matter what different researchers say about languages of dolphins or bees or monkeys or whatever. Humans are living organisms, and language must have a biological function. Well, it's not my revelation, of course, as you understand. Remember Maturana's biology of language, biology of cognition. Now, every living organism is striving to survive and reproduce. And to survive, we must, or every living organism must adapt. The fittest survives. And of course, adaptation implies the ability to orient in the environment. And this is the biological function of the senses. Now, where does language come in here? Now, who is the fittest among all living organisms known today? We humans. And we are the kings of nature because we are capable of changing the world and adapting it to our own needs. Now, what makes us kings of nature? What powers? The only thing humans have that no other species have is language. So could it be language to which we owe our unparalleled cognitive powers? As Charles Morris back in 1938 indicated in his seminal Foundations of the Theory of Science, evolutionarily, language is an extension of the human sensorium. He defined it as the ability of humans to take account of a constantly more remote, perceptually not present environment in controlling their interactions with the world. And the function of language thus appears to be interactional orientational, and this is very important. Now, to take account of what is not perceptually present is to perform an operation of abstraction when a concept is grasped by a word, natural linguistic sign. And as a process, it is abstraction of the first order. Linguistic interactions or languaging establish a second-order consensual domain, we call language, as operations on first-order abstractions, or a relational domain. Language, thus, becomes a specifically human ecological niche. And an organism and its niche form a unity, an organism-environment system, whose components are characterized by reciprocal causality. You cannot understand the organism without taking into account the environment, and you cannot understand the environment without taking into account the organism. Now, what linguistics, as the self-proclaimed science, has been busy with over the past century, was studying language, in itself and for itself. Living talking humans outside and bracketing it out. And this is basically, in my opinion, the main drawback of linguistics, which allows me and other people who think along the same lines to say that linguistics is not actually a science. At best, it is a pre-science. Now, as an epigenetic factor, the complexification of the human ecological needs triggered an adaptational response, directing the evolution of the human brain. As Terence Deacon very well showed in his seminal monograph of 1997, language and the human brain co-evolved. As a relational domain, language became an operational mode of existence, the cognitive domain of humans as observers, or a manner of living in recurrent interactions in a flow of coordinations of consensual behaviors. The evolution of living systems is the evolution of their cognitive domains, and the cognitive domain of humans is the domain of language. And now we come to the issue of the relationship between language and mind, as was shown in a seminal paper in 1995 by Maturana and his colleagues. Every animal has a brain that thinks according to the manner of living that it lives. The human brain thinks in language. And the ability to language gives rise to abstract thought. This is important. This is what I think people don't want to accept or understand. Now, what about writing? The invention of writing marked a new stage in the evolution of humans and had two profound effects. First, as a process, it is operation on second-order abstractions, that is, written words as signs of natural linguistic science. Note that although we are used and taught at school, to thinking about written words as words, they're not really words. They're not linguistic units, if we, by linguistic units, refer to something that makes up what we call natural language. Okay? Written words are signs of natural linguistic science. So reading and writing radically enhanced the ability for abstract thought based in language and its operations on first-order abstractions, giving rise to a new mode of thinking and transforming human cognitive powers. As a mode of thinking applied to understanding, the function of natural language literally reconstructs language. I'm sorry, I'm sorry. As a mode of thinking applied to understanding the function of natural language, literacy reconstructs language, becoming a culturally constructed cognitive niche in which language evolves phylogenetically and ontogenetically. As a result, by making the world on paper our habit or habitats, we developed a blindness to reality itself. The reality of natural language is our cognitive domain in which we grow and develop as the unique species of talking animal. Now, the distinctions we make in language. What's in a name? To remember Shakespeare. It is very unfortunate that we are known, thanks to Carl Linnaeus, as Homo sapiens, because Linnaeus violated his own principle of taxonomy, he used, taking as a differential feature, something easily observable, and sapiens is not something easily observable. A much more appropriate name was the name offered by Johann Herder, Homo locens. Now the question is, do we talk because we are smart, as people are used to believe? Or are we smart because we can talk? And of course, I answer the question like this. We are smart and we are sapient because we can talk. And everything we have created, our modern civilization, is grounded in our ability to, quote unquote, use language. That is, to talk and later write and read. As a species, we emerged with the emergence of language, period. And of course, the distinctions we make in the relational domain of language affect how we construct the world around what systems of values. We are what we do, and everything we do in language. That is why we do not live up to the name Homo sapiens, but have yet to learn to live up to the name Homo locans. And this is something hard to accept to many linguists. And because language is the constitutive feature of the niches of human populations as living systems, changes in the praxis of languaging lead to changes in the niches, which can be evolutionarily beneficial for human populations, but destructive for wider ecological systems. As Gibson observed in 1979, there is only one world, however diverse, and all animals live in it, although we human animals have altered it to suit ourselves. And this takes us to the issue of objectivity with parentheses. You know, another big issue in contemporary epistemology. There's this dispute going on between objectivists and constructivists, you know, what is reality, what exists, and so on and so forth. Now, mindless of the place and role of language in the evolution of our species as the dominant species on our planet, we fall victims to our mode of living in the world on paper, when we think that language is just a tool that we use to do certain things with what we call information, although nobody knows what information is, just like nobody knows what knowledge is. And this creates, what I call intellectual havoc, actually. Unwilling to break with the old habits, we continue to play with language as if it were some kind of fascinating gadget out there in the so-called objective world that exists independent of what we think about it. But the world we see from our house of being as objectivity without parentheses, and that's a very good phrase I like, you know, used by Maturana, is not independent of us as observers, because as observers, we arise in language, and this makes us ecologically special, special to such a degree that no other animal can stand even close to us. But being ecologically special, we continue to be ecologically destructive, bringing changes to the environment that affect the ecological niches of each and every living organism on the planet. And of course, the current situation, you know, is disastrous. You know, forests disappear, you know, deserts claim more and more land, you know, seas disappear. Well, you know, nuclear energy poses a great threat to the humanity. Yeah, you name it, you know. There's a whole pile of problems that we have created, you know, trying, I don't know for what reason or why, to destroy our very habitat, our own planet. But to conclude, I'd like to ask the question, is there a way out? Why are we doing what we have been doing over the millennia? And is there a solution to this situation? I think the root of the problem is in our not understanding the nature of humanness. That is, what makes us human. what it is that makes us what we are. And if we remember that the relational domain of language is our cognitive domain in which we orient, we must also admit that we orient to affordances provided by this domain and realize values that we identify in this relational domain. And historically determined cultural systems of values do not exist outside of language. They affect the existential trajectories followed by societies and their individual members. And you may have noticed how today's Russia is serving a very good example of changing the existential trajectory. Today in Russia, we are back to the utopian world described very well in intricate details by Orwell in his 1984. And by the mere change of our languaging praxis in Russia, the Russian quote unquote leadership, is changing the entire system of values and the entire trajectory for the whole society. And this is the tragedy that people living in Russia don't seem to realize or understand at all. Now, as the dominant species, we should be responsible for the choices we make and the trajectories we follow in the world of the living. And the world we live in is the world we make in language. And the world we make makes us what we are. When we understand this, we will find our path unwinding in this circle of life, a path to a brighter day and a better ecologically minded civilization. And it all starts with our reconceptualization of what language is and what language does to us, with us, and with the world. Because we humans exist in language. And the world of humans is the world we construct in language by making distinctions. And the distinctions we make determine the paths that we go. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexander. Maybe you can stop your screen share, then we can see each other more.
Now I want to, how do I get?
I think there's a green button at the top. There we go. Okay. So my vision is not such that I can read anything in the chat. So you will need to bring up questions by raising a hand, or perhaps somebody else could go through the chat and pick up any questions from there or comments. Thank you, Alexander. As I've known your work before, I have just heard it in a different package now. And I wonder how do we get to see that we have created the world that we live in? Isn't language a bit like water for us, the fish living in the water, we living in the language? So isn't it just very easy to take it for granted that this is it? How do we get out of that?
That's a good question. The question is simple, but the hardest thing in this world is to find an answer to a simple question. I believe that a lot could be done beginning with the entire system of education. I think that's where the problem starts, to give people a chance to learn to look at some very well-known habitual things in a new way. You have to teach them to keep their eyes open and to look where they haven't been looking. Take, for example, the practice of teaching language at school. children coming to school learn that words consist of letters. And they are asked to give examples of words starting with a particular letter and so on and so forth. But words do not consist of letters. Words that consist of letters are not really words. They are second-order semiotic phenomena. They are signs of signs. But this obvious thing seems to be unnoticed. It goes totally unnoticed by linguists. And they keep talking about words, written words and spoken words as if it were one and the same thing. You know, it's like talking about the mankind, or humankind, I'm sorry. Political correctness is something that sometimes poses problems to me. But I can say we are all human, right? But being human, we are divided into males and females, and there's nothing that we can do about it. Yeah, we are all human, but we are different. Now, spoken words and written words, are also different. Well, and when we say that the written word is the same as the spoken word, it's the same as to say this nice lady is the same as this nice gentleman, And this is totally distorting the entire picture. There are a lot of other things that we inherit or learn through the educational process, like take communication, People tend to identify or equate communication with languaging and languaging with communication. But again, while any instance of languaging is a way of is communication in a way, not every communication is languaging. Animals communicate, humans communicate, but animals don't have language. Humans do. Now, there are a lot of serious people writing serious books, even getting Nobel Prizes, proving that there are animal languages. This is preposterous. But because we believe in authorities, and school instills in students this habit, of looking up to authorities, we take it for granted that if a well-known guy says that this is so, it is so. And that's the problem with education, in my opinion. Of course, I may not be right. I may be criticized for that. But giving my freshman students this year a course, an introductory course to the theory of language, I'm trying to unteach them, to make them unlearn what they have been learning at school for 11 years. I tell them, forget what they taught you at school, because it has very little to do with our life, with what we do in life. And of course, it sounds strange, but by and by, those of them who are really interested in language begin to see the picture in a different way. And this is very encouraging. It is a sign that myself and my colleagues are trying to go in the right direction, so to speak. But I don't have a definitive answer to your question, Peter. I'm sorry.
More hands are popping up, so let's try and keep the question response a little shorter if we can. And this is Robert Cutler, please. Are you available as a on video too?
Yes, I don't know how presentable I am because it's Sunday morning here, so I will test my camera a little later and perhaps I'll make an appearance, but the image is representative. I want to thank Alexander Kravchenko for a very thoughtful presentation and one which makes me think. And during the course of his presentation, I formulated two questions. And as he continued, I realized that they were related to each other, although they're separable from each other. So let me state the questions. and he is free to answer one of them, or both of them, or neither of them, as he sees fit. I believe I recall correctly that towards the beginning of the presentation, the image was offered that humans exist in an ecological niche surrounded by language, or something like that. I'm not exactly restating, those weren't your exact words. But in terms of, excuse me, considering the biological metaphor, and especially the invocation of Macerana, for example, it occurred to me, as it has in my own work in other contexts. By the way, I'm a social scientist. I analyze international relations. I used to be an expert on Soviet foreign policy back when the Soviet Union existed. And since then, I've gone into other related things, but not Russian affairs. More like, anyway, but that's another story. That's a personal biography, intellectual biography. But so my question is, my first question, my first topic that I offer to you is, a cell has a cell wall, and a cell wall has a non-zero diameter. It's not just a pencil mark on a page, and it mediates what flows into the cell and what flows out of the cell. So that if humans are the cell, so to speak, and language, for example, is the environment, then what in this image, in this metaphor or analogy, uh, is the cell wall? Now, I propose an answer which you are not obliged to accept, in order to move to the second, still more provocative question. Perhaps, or perhaps not, the cell wall is culture. Well, whether it is because culture then enables to transform the environment through language and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, you can fill in all those blanks. To get to the second question, or the second part of the question, if it is culture, or even if it is not, I would invite you to say a few words about something that I'm certain you've considered deeply, but which was absent from your conversation, from your presentation, which is the validity or not of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. If human beings construct the world with their language, and if different peoples have different languages that are themselves constructed in different ways, what does this mean for their living in different worlds or their cultures to be able to construct future worlds? And I land on the very provocative note, which is I could give the example of Russian having the perfective and imperfective, as opposed to the Indo-European language, the European languages having six tenses, or the Germans have problems with some things because they never know what they're really doing until they get to the verb at the end of the sentence. Or you could talk about the Turkic languages with all of their embedded verbal clauses, and all of the other American Indian examples that Worf gave in his works. And so the provocative, in order to end with an exclamation point. There we go. Provocatively, I give the extreme example of of someone who might entertain that, is that I pose the question: was there, for example, something in the way that the West European, including especially English, languages were constructed, and the categories that arose out of their social formations of the medieval era, for example, that made it possible to have categories of life and law and society that made it possible for industrialization to take root there, where it did not anywhere else in other societies where it might have done, such as China, which was technologically advanced at a certain point of its history in the centuries ago, but did not take that route. So that is the provocative point, and I'm not suggesting that I subscribe to it, although I can probably argue it either way. And that's the second part of my question. So please, you have a smorgasbord, you have a buffet. Please take whatever you like to address.
Well, there are quite a few questions as I see them. Well, as for culture, there are so many definitions of culture, and they are sometimes so different from one another that I don't think it's really a good idea to talk about culture as a concept, that has a universally accepted interpretation. I have my own idiosyncratic understanding of culture. To me, culture comes second after language, not first. But I would like to pick up your example. You mentioned different languages. You mentioned the perfective, imperfective in Russian, and the tenses in European languages. Well, let me tell you, because the function of natural language doesn't matter which, English, Russian, Chinese, whatever. The function of natural language is interactional orientational, okay? It doesn't really matter what clothes a particular language is wearing. What matters is what is underneath the clothes. And underneath, it's the same thing. It's an adaptational mechanism for orienting in the world, taking account of those aspects of the environment that are not perceptually present. Any language does that. And coming back to perfective, imperfective in Russian, Russian grammarians, people who write grammars, including academic grammars, the most authoritative sources, don't have the least idea of what they are writing about. They have no understanding at all what the grammatical category of aspect in Russian is about. Interestingly, lots of problems for Russians learning English, are explained away once you show the students that basically between English and Russian as orientational activities, there isn't much difference. In Russian, there are not two aspects. Well, there are not two forms, but three forms of aspectually marked verbs, okay? And generally, the category of aspect, perfective, the so-called perfective, imperfective, is not an explanation of what aspect is. Aspect in Russian is about the distinction drawn systematically in language between what is observed and what is just known. And I teach, when I teach English to my students, I tell them, every time we speak, whether Russian or English or whatever, we speak either about what we observe or about what we know, period. And every language must have certain means to mark this very important distinction. It is marked in Russian and it is marked in English, You take English grammar, all these so-called tenses, which are not tenses, but tense aspect forms. And my students usually get surprised when they learn that there are not 12 tenses in English, but only 3, if there are 3 tenses in Russian. But if there are 12 tenses in English, then there are at least 11 tenses in Russian. And when I show my students how these grammatical categories are built in Russian and in English, that they are practically identical, only wearing different clothes, a huge stumbling block in acquiring English grammar disappears. But that's just a concrete example. As for the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, personally, I believe that these people, well, it started not with them. We should remember von Humboldt first, they had a vision, And I think they thought along the same lines as later was done by Maturana and other constructivists. And, this habit of looking at the world around us as something independent of us, instilled in us by the education systems, in especially in Western societies. This habit actually makes us blind to what our life, the life of humans, is really like, what it is about. It is not about cognizing the independent reality. It's about realizing values by interacting with the environment, and to humans, this environment first and foremost is other humans speaking a common language, and that common language is what makes a community a unity of interactions, to use Maturana's terminology, or a living system of third order living system as compared to individuals, the second order living systems. And as for the cell wall, I don't think cell wall, the metaphor of the cell wall, when you try to explain the role of culture in what we do when we language, I don't think it's quite appropriate, because, cells in Maturana's biology of cognition are systems, living systems of first order. And we speak about language as a distinctive feature of second order living systems, or higher animals with nervous systems and brains. And as I've already said, I don't believe in culture as something that enhances or stimulates or somehow triggers the development of language. It's the other way around. Culture is the product of language. And there are as many cultures as there are languages. Moreover, if you try to think about the mistake that Linnaeus made in his taxonomy, we all used to thinking that there is only one species, Homo sapiens. But is there really only one species, Homo sapiens, if we replace the name Homo sapiens with Homo locans? Take, for example, bears. There are 8 known species of bears. The brown bear, the polar bear, the panda, and the other bears, 8. And some of them don't look as different as do representatives of different races found on the face of this planet. If you take, for example, a 2-meter tall blonde Norwegian with blue eyes, and put him next to a pygmy from Africa, the difference will be much more pronounced than between a couple of bears belonging to different species. And if you take the Indian tribes in the jungles of the Amazonia, yes, they are, according to the accepted taxonomy, Homo sapiens. But are they the same kind of Homo sapiens as Homo sapiens from Europe, China, Japan, or other developed countries? I don't think so. This is a thought that may be disliked by people, that may be, run down for being, I don't know, non-scientific. But this is something that I've been thinking about lately. If we are not really Homo sapiens, but if we are Homo locans, is there just only one species of Homo? That's the question.
We should also, I'm going to interrupt and say we really should let some of more people have questions, have a choice to answer. We're going along. We should make the pieces a little shorter, both in the question and the answer, so everybody can participate. Please, Judy, you're next.
Hi. Thank you very much, and I'll be brief. This is very interesting because I have studied with many of the people you speak, well, with Maturana in particular. And I think that what, in response to the question you asked at the end, I think to talk about language without talking about languaging is an example of reductionism. And I think that we're losing in this, for me, the conversation is losing the idea that any uttering is always in an emotioning state of being. And that combination of languaging generates, networks of languaging generate conversations, networks of conversations might generate culture is one way of looking at it that I think I take from Maturana. But I think that one of the things we need to really begin to focus more on is this concept of languaging when we talk about language. And I think the indigenous people who can orient us rather than teach us, because you can't teach anyone anything, that orient us or could orient us in more in understanding this dynamic of languaging. So thank you.
Well, yes, I agree entirely that languaging and language are sort of two sides of the same medal. And when I teach English to my students, I always tell them language is not about communication, or languaging is not about communication. It's about interaction. It's about interaction and coordination. And when they get the idea, they begin to make much better progress in acquiring conversation skills. Yes, you're right.
So, Christina.
Alexander, thank you for your presentation. And I would like first to express my solidarity as a linguist, because I also had to have enormous conversations and arguments with linguists that are working with something else. They are not working with language, and they are not interested in adopting another point of view, because linguistics itself was created to study la langue and not langage. This we can distinguish in Portuguese, so it makes our lives a little bit easier. I have studied Maturana for a long time, and my doctoral thesis was on languaging. And I also studied with Richard Rorty to understand where Maturana was talking from in this enormous philosophical traditions, and where I could place him, because I saw some very peculiar principles in Maturana that I couldn't fit in the philosophical trends that we had available. So one of the most interesting things I have in Maturana is the non-essentialistic view. So now it's a question, because you said that Maturana didn't solve the issues about language in a satisfactory way for you. And but I have one question specifically. When you say that humans have the predisposition to sapience, are you not stepping back to an essentialism that we don't need? If you think systemically, historically, ontogenetically, you may abandon this essentialism. Also, you said that the origin and nature of mind, consciousness, and thought remain unexplained. I think that Maturana gives a very good hints about it, but we have to be more radical in systemic sense.
Well,
and
Maturana
less essentialist also.
Yeah, Maturana and his colleagues said that consciousness, mind, thought were not entities, out there. They were just explanatory notions, and most of the problems, that philosophers keep fighting with, stem from their predisposition to look at certain distinctions made in language, as indicating the existence of some entities, like consciousness, mind, or whatever, knowledge, what is knowledge, If you analyze the way we use the word knowledge, then knowledge is a thing. It's out there somewhere, hidden from us, and our job is to look for it, to find it, to use it to our benefit. But knowledge is not a thing, consciousness is not a thing. Cognitivists, especially first-generation cognitivists, have been trying to find the substrate, of consciousness, studying the brain, and they still do that in many locations, but they won't find anything. Yeah, I'm not an essentialist, so I don't see any divergent points here between your position and mine. There are no such things as consciousness or mind or thoughts. These are the distinctions made in language.
Andrei, you've been waiting for a while. You're muted. Can't hear you.
Yes. Hi. Thank you, Professor Kravchenko. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. There's a couple of items in your presentation that I'd like to take issue with. And one of them has to do with your observation that the world we live in is the world we make in language. There's a question of who is we? Because to me, it seems that in the era of mass communication, we exist in a world of language which is constructed by a small elite of very powerful people, and that the prison of language is actively constructed by a handful of extremely wealthy and powerful individuals that have control over the means of mass communication. And that this is, in fact, what leads to the ecological disaster that you've mentioned. And my second observation has to do with point 3 of your biocognitive paradigm, namely with the goals of survival and reproduction that are common to all living beings. And I'd like to argue that what distinguishes humans on a cybernetic level is the ability to set goals that go beyond survival and reproduction, or are disconnected, not subordinated to survival and reproduction, such as, for example, I don't know, endless enrichment, endless accumulation of wealth. My suggestion is that this difference should be considered, should be taken into account in formulating a biocognitive paradigm on that level. And that's all I have for now. Thank you again very much for a very interesting.
Yeah, my answer to your first question is that I do agree with the point you make. And when I say we construct the world in language, I refer to, let's put it like this, to the evolutionary historical process of languaging as a natural kind of activity characteristic of our species. But of course, in modern times, you are absolutely correct. Certain very narrow circles, having great power to control the world on paper, affect the kind of distinctions made, not by us, common sense people, but the distinctions they want to be made in language. And as I already mentioned, this is what's happening in Russia today, unfortunately. So, yes, you're right about that, but it doesn't cancel my observation that we when I say we, I mean we, the biological species known as Homo sapiens, okay, on a historical evolutionary scale, so to speak. So as for the second question, survival and reproduction, yes, you are correct. Again, making that point that about goals that go beyond survival and reproduction. But these goals going beyond survival and reproduction do not cancel survival and reproduction as our existential imperatives. So they coexist. So we have to probably pay attention to what kind of relationship is there between our certain goals and our natural pursuit of to survive and reproduce. You know, there's a very complex interplay here. But as I said, one doesn't cancel the other. And when I said biologic, I meant really biologic, you know, the biological side of it. And setting goals is already an add-on to what we can do, building or constructing our world in language as Homo localis. So I don't see any disagreements.
Elena, you seem to be having your hand up too.
Yes. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. One of the things that struck me as we were beginning, particularly as you mentioned the ecological challenges, is what is our challenge if we attempt to speak in language about the needs of other species, or in fact about the needs of other entities such as rivers, looking at, you know, what does a bear need? What does a bird need? And it strikes me that they also participate in at least the first two, and I would argue the three, of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, of physiological needs, safety needs. And he speaks about love and belonging, but I would speak more about community and connection. Do you think we can speak on behalf of other than humans?
Well, certainly we can, but if we do, we will be continuing the same old practice, you know, of philosophical dualism. There are us humans, the center of the universe, and everything else. And who are we to speak on behalf of other animals? I don't think this is what should be the goal of the now growing movement known as ecolinguistics. You know, there are a lot of researchers now who actually do what you're talking about. You know, they write papers and books about the need for us humans, you know, to talk about needs of other animals and entities in nature and stuff like that. But in my opinion, doing that will be just a continuation of the old dualist practice, you know, of opposing us cognizing humans to the so-called objective world, or what Maturana called objectivity without parentheses. And the important thing is just to understand that parenthesis part of objectivity. You know what? I'm giving a short course to sophomores on ecolinguistics. And I begin by asking them whether they have seen the movie Avatar by James Cameron. Because that movie is a must to anybody who is really concerned about finding a solution to the ecological disasters we are now facing. That's what I can say for now.
Anybody else have some spontaneous?
There are some questions in the chat. There is one from Margarita Carroll. Do you want to make the question? Or should I read this?
Sure. Hi. Thank you for the space. Here, I'll make a video just for a moment. Hi. Yeah, I had written that I was born in Ukraine, the week of Chernobyl, and I grew up speaking Russian after we moved to America. I'm wondering, how would you discuss the goals of Russification in Ukraine through the lens of cybernetics? How would we discuss what the goals were there of one group of humans over another?
I have no idea. I'm afraid I don't have anything else to offer.
Sorry about that.
Okay, there is another question in the chat. It's from Larry Richards. Is biology an explanatory principle?
An explanatory principle in what?
Well, I'll just question myself about this idea of culture following language. And the question is, does biology follow language?
No. No, it doesn't. Language is part of our biology.
Not sure I see the logic. First of all, thank you very much. This was a very refreshing framing of this problem of language and really appreciate that. But if I live in language, if everything I know and do in language, then that it has to include any explanations that I have of any kind, whether they be cultural or biological, and I guess it goes back to Pille's question: how do you get out of this soup called that we're swimming in called language? And the answer, I mean, you can't get out of it. I think you have to recognize that a part of living in language is that we live in metaphors, we live in logics, and as a consequence, we create categories, we create types, and I mean, it's amazing that we can talk about language. We use language to talk about language, but as a consequence of that, we live in inconsistencies and paradoxes and conflicts and eventually disagreements. And that's life. And I guess I'm a little concerned that biology is presented as a I don't know, a solution almost to this whole thing.
I'm afraid I'm not quite clear on the final part of your question, the solution to what?
To our ecological problem.
There's something with the sound. I hear the word problem, but what problem?
Ecological.
Oh, ecological. Oh, yes. Okay. I'm sorry. Yeah. Well, I think that the solution to the ecological problem lies in understanding the nature of what we call humanness. Yeah, what makes us human? What makes us what we are? And my idea is that we are human because we talk, because we do everything that we do in language, as you observed, and we are so used to using language, just like we are used to breathing air, without ever noticing it, how often do you think that you need air to breathe if you are in normal health condition? You don't give it a second thought. Only when something happens with your respiratory system, you begin to pay attention to that. Otherwise, you just breathe. That's your natural state, your natural condition. It's about the same thing with language. It's our natural state, our natural condition to talk. And we don't notice, what the important things are that happen when we talk this way or that way about certain things. We don't, that's my conviction, my personal conviction. We don't understand the importance of those distinctions that we make in language, okay? For example, let me give you an example to help you understand what I mean. According to some social polls conducted recently in Russia, 75% of respondents, said that if they knew that they would not be caught, they would steal. They have no problem with that, 75%. So what does that tell us? Was it always like that? No, it wasn't. But there was a certain time in the history of the Soviet Union and the Soviet life, when the so-called planned economy, could not provide the necessary amount of commodities for the internal market. You wanted tea. Russians like tea. You went to the store, but there was no tea. And that's interesting because there was, for example, in the city of Irkutsk, there was a tea packing factory to which hundreds of thousands of tons of tea arrived every year. It was packed here in Irkutsk, but you could not find tea in Irkutsk. It was packed here and sent somewhere else. So, and it was the same with anything you wanted. You wanted to buy nails to nail a bookshelf on the wall. You couldn't find nails in the store. Your daughter, was getting married and you wanted to arrange for a festive dinner, but you couldn't get any good food stuff, to treat your guests to, And the country kept working, the industries kept working, everybody was busy producing something. And that's when an interesting phenomenon appeared, when people began to solve their problems by simply taking from their workplaces what they manufactured and then, trading it for likewise, taken or stolen products, from other workplaces. And it was a mass phenomenon, and the Communist Party tried to fight with it, but they couldn't. And they found a way out of this situation, They couldn't announce that the total, the majority of Soviet citizens, were petty thieves, They couldn't admit that. They couldn't be thieves because the Soviet people were the most progressive, form of society, according to the communists, So what they said, what they did was take out of circulation just one word, thief, wor in Russian. And when someone was caught with stolen products, he was not called a thief. He was called a carrier, someone who carries. He carries stuff. Somebody carries sausages home from his workplace. Somebody carries nails. Somebody carries a piece of textile or fabric or whatever. A pair of shoes, doesn't matter. They don't steal, they carry. In my estimation, 3 generations of people grew up in a country where to take something that is not yours to steal was not considered to be theft. And with time, we came to the situation today in Russia when 75% of people believe that to steal is not really bad if you're not getting caught, so what's the big deal? So if you can take something that doesn't belong to you and you don't do it, you're stupid, you're a fool. Now, what kind of economy can you build in a country like that? None. All talk of our government about, progress in economic development and stuff like that is you know what. So back to the issue of distinctions we make in language. I like the principle I formulated. I took a phrase ascribed to Stalin, who they say used to say, if there's a man, there's a problem. No man, no problem. I changed it, and now I sometimes tell my students, if there is a word, there is a concept. If there is no word, there is no concept. Okay? And although people, philosophers particularly, talk about concepts that exist but don't have names, this is empty talk to me. Concepts exist because they are grasped by words, and the kind of words we use to speak about concepts, to grasp them, define the atmosphere, the social atmosphere in which we interact with one another. And that's where ecological problems start, where they begin. So they begin with the distinctions we make in language.
We have come almost to the end of our time. So whatever further questions are, we'll have to deal with them quickly. We have 5 more minutes left. So are there any more in the chat box that haven't been addressed?
Yes.
Been waiting.
Yes. We have a question by Ali Taheri. Do you want to start? Question, Ali?
Yeah. So it's a phenomenon I've been tracking in different languages, specifically my language, Farsi. I've been feeling that the unity of language can break in a society, and although everyone are speaking the same language, but they've been polarized culturally so much from each other that they don't actually understand. They think they understand each other, but they actually don't. So I was wondering if it's just something that happens throughout history, because we have archetypal stories in even religion about the breaking of the unity of the language, like the Babel stories. But I was wondering if anybody like or Mr. Alexander research about that phenomenon, and is it possible to track it in a specific language? It could be any language.
I'm afraid I didn't quite catch the essence of the question.
The essence is like, so we use language to communicate different ideas, right? But we are never sure that if what I have in my mind been converted to sound proper words, and if they do, I'm never sure that you get what is in my mind, because our mind don't connect to each other. So we use language to communicate. Now the problem is, if a unity of language breaks, I say something and I feel I'm saying something, but you translated in your mind in a different ways, so we never can actually understand each other, but we don't know that we are not understanding each other.
Well, the idea that we use language to communicate, is one of those delusions that modern linguistic orthodoxy goes by. And, about 100 years ago, 200 years ago, nobody spoke about communication, as exchange of ideas. All this fancy talk about communication became, fashionable with the so-called cognitive revolution and the invention of computers, especially after Claude Shannon's paper on theory of communication, mathematical theory of communication. We do not exchange ideas, we do not exchange thoughts, and when we interact with other people, talking to other people, we do not exchange ideas, we don't send any mental representations from one head to another. What we do, we send signals, okay? But because we have common experience, because we operate in the same consensual domain, we have common experience of these signals, and we have the experience of how these signals are used to coordinate our behavior, and how they are used to orient us and others, in this relational domain. And only because of this common experience can we interpret them more or less in a uniform way. But there isn't any mental content transferred in communication by means of language. That's what I'm strongly against, as part of the linguistic orthodoxy. I've been writing, I don't know, for like a quarter century about this as something, that doesn't make any real sense at all.
Oh, great, thanks. That actually makes a lot of sense, because as long as there is a common understanding and we can orient ourselves around it, we have a better communication. But when we lose that, the unity of languages breaks and we actually do not understand each other. Because language basically doesn't do that in any way, do not connect us mentally to each other. Okay, that makes sense.
When we
Thank you.
stop understanding each other, it means only one thing. Somebody has been tampering with language as our existential domain. And this is something that shouldn't be done. Well, again, that's my personal opinion.
We don't hear you, Pille.
Thank you for reminding me to take my mute off. Yes, we have come now to the end of our time, and I'd like to thank you, Alexandra, for taking the time at this odd time of night to be with us now after midnight the next day. And
I would like to thank you for giving me this opportunity, thank you very much.
This, as you know, will be recorded, so you will be able to see the recordings afterwards.
Yeah. Thanks a lot.
So thank you from everybody to you.
All right. You all have a nice day. Here it's night.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Bye.
Alexander. Thank you,
Bye.
Bye-bye.